Freddie Scappaticci was one of the IRA's top men, a man now named in intelligence leaks as Stakeknife, codename of a British spy who fooled the IRA for 25 years.
It's a Saturday morning in April 2003, and a string of stories accusing Freddie Scappaticci of being an army agent have just been published. They say that the IRA's top spycatcher in the nutting squad was also an agent himself, and Scap's not happy about it.
Get yourselves off. Go on. Fuck off. You're causing enough problems in this house. Take yourself off.
Reporters from the BBC show up at Scap's Belfast home to ask him about his secret double life. His reactions read by an actor.
Fucking all that stuff on the TV and everything else about us. My family's suffering here. Now fuck off, you and him.
He storms towards the reporters, wearing a checkered dressing gown with sandals, his arm waving aggressively.
And take no more photos of this house. And you too. Fucking sick of my family being tortured here over yous. Fucking scum yous are. Stories yous make up. Don't be holding your hand and saying it's nothing to do with you. Don't take any more photos of this house, I'm telling you now. Because if you do, I'll come out and I'll fucking do you.
A video of this encounter was only published for the first time in 2024, more than 20 years after it was filmed, because Scap got an injunction against the BBC. It's clear evidence of how far Scap will go to shield his family. Until this moment, his wife and kids haven't known anything about his life as a spy. Reporter John Ware says,
"This is the authentic Freddie, the built ex-bricklayer. I mean, threatening, ferociously, menacingly. And you can see the crew taking a step back, because this guy could easily have swung a very heavy punch."
A few days later, Scap makes a much calmer appearance. And this time, he denies everything. This is his real voice.
I am Freddie Scappaticci. I'm sitting here today with my solicitor. I am telling you I am not guilty of any of these allegations. I have not left Northern Ireland since I was challenged by reporters on Saturday night. Nobody had the decency to ask me if any of these allegations were true and why the police had not come to question me about these allegations.
But this is all lies. Scap is guilty of the allegations, of being involved in torture and murder while spying for the Force Research Unit, and he has left Northern Ireland since those stories came out. He escaped to England with MI5's help, then, within 36 hours, decided he'd rather chance his luck in Belfast. This is the beginning of a saga that runs for 2 decades, where the British state fervently protect Freddie Scappaticci, despite everything he's done. The saga ends 15 years later in a leafy Surrey suburb, in Guildford, where Scap is living a comfortable retirement in a detached house bought for him by the state. It's hidden behind a tall privet hedge, 2 feet taller than others on the street. Neighbours know him as someone who keeps himself to himself, a quiet man called Frank Conway. The story of how Scap went from verbally abusing those reporters to hiding in plain sight in Guildford takes us from government offices to MI5 headquarters, police cells to the courtroom. It's a story that has never been told in full before, which reveals how multiple institutions protected Freddie Scappaticci, the spy who got away with murder. I'm Cara McGugan, and this is Bed of Lies, Episode 7, Cover Up. It's been 9 months since I first went to see reporter John Ware at his home in London. In that time, I've learned that he's the sort of reporter that never puts a story to bed. He's checked in with his contacts from Northern Ireland for the last 50 years and kept looking for new details. After some recent digging, he's found evidence that proves just how high up the state's cover-up of the agent Stakeknife went.
It's the story of how this spy escaped justice for murder and torture of fellow British agents, and the attempts by the British security and intelligence establishment to protect him.
John and I have joined forces to report this episode. We've been sifting through the new evidence and interviewing key people together. He'll be going through the revelations with me.
You know, I've been going to this place for 50 years.
Documentary evidence we know does exist.
I know we can't get into all that, but...
To set the scene, we need to go back to 2003.
Britain's top IRA spy is in hiding tonight, his cover blown by newspapers in Scotland, Belfast and Dublin.
Detail after detail is being published about Freddie Scappaticci's alleged role in 14 murders and 15 abductions, each one as vicious and cold-hearted as the last.
This investigation has found he cost more lives than he saved, and he should have been charged with murder.
People have been burned with pokers and they've been set on the rings of electric cookers.
Facing a wall, blindfolded.
Sandy Lynch is completely stripped naked.
Voice whispering in your ear, "Hello, son."
You know who I am, don't you? If I had my way, I'd have you hanging upside down and skinned alive.
And you'll be begging for death by the time I shoot you.
One of the killings where he's got the guy blindfolded and he shoots him in the back of the head.
Bodies winding up in woodland.
No one's going to hear your screams. And if you knew Scappaticci, that puts the fear of God into you.
Scappaticci was central to Joe Fenton's execution.
Vincent Robinson, Anthony McKinnon, Michael Kearney asked to pray before he was shot. James Jazz Young, his body found on a border road. Patrick Traynor, reportedly shot in the head by Scappaticci.
It's just appalling stuff, nightmarish, horror movie stuff. It's just a moral black hole.
Claims that he was responsible for saving countless or hundreds of lives are hugely exaggerated. Stakeknife was himself involved in very serious and wholly unjustifiable criminality.
The truth was out in the open. Scap had been compromised. Amid fears the IRA could give him a taste of his own medicine and execute him for being a tout, he hit the panic button. MI5 squirreled him out of Belfast.
To somewhere in England and met officers from MI5's resettlement unit.
With Scap safely out of the IRA's reach, MI5 said to him,
"Freddie, game's up. There's no going back this time. You've got to be resettled."
They offered to find him somewhere to live and give him a new identity, but he refused. He wanted to go back to Belfast and his family.
He said, "None of my family, not my wife, my children, know anything about the fact that I've been an agent. And, I need to break that news to them."
He also had a family holiday booked, and his daughter was about to sit her exams.
That was just the first example of chutzpah from this wily guy who was confident he could bluff his way out of this boulder's brass. He said, "I don't need resettlement. What you could do is get me a ticket to the Champions League," because Scappaticci was a lifelong football supporter.
MI5 told Scap that if he really wanted to return, he had to sign a waiver.
Saying that he had rejected their offer of resettlement, gone back to Belfast of his own volition, and he did sign it.
Scap's refusal to disappear wouldn't have surprised MI5, given how he'd behaved over the last decade. His fall had begun back in 1990, when he escaped justice for the abduction and torture of Special Branch agent Sandy Lynch. Others involved were convicted, but Scap got off scot-free. The IRA leadership had become suspicious and expelled him. Scap hadn't taken the change in status well. Former IRA member Ricky O'Rourke researched this period for his book, Stakeknife's Dirty War.
This guy was very narcissistic. He was used to walking into a room and people stood up. All respect, all honour revolved around him. And now he walked into a room and nobody gave a fuck about him. And he had what's called a narcissistic collapse. It's when a narcissist's whole raison d'etre falls apart and he's just an ordinary Joe again. And he couldn't handle it at all.
Scapp tried as best as he could to cling on to his special status as terrorist and spy.
He went to families whose sons and daughters had been shot dead, and he tried to portray himself as a humane executioner. He demanded of the Frew, for example, that they bring him to the GOC, Northern Ireland, the General Officer Commandant, the top British Army officer, and he wanted reassurance that he was still valuable. General Wolseley patted him on the back and says, "You're still a great guy, Freddie, we still love you. You're still the jewel in the crown."
But it wasn't true. By 1995, Scapp was no longer useful to the Frew, so they retired him as an agent. At that point, MI5 made their first offer of resettlement, but he refused. Now in 2003, he chose to return to Belfast just 36 hours after he was outed in the press, back into the IRA's lair.
He insisted on a meeting with senior members of the IRA.
That's John Ware again.
Scapp says, "You know this is a load of crap." And they're sitting there poker-faced, obviously thinking, "Freddie, you know and we know why you're still alive, so just behave yourself." I'm imagining the conversation, but it will have been something like that.
Scapp told the IRA he would publicly deny that he was the agent Stakeknife, thus saving his reputation and theirs. The Republican movement had changed. They were now focused on securing the fragile peace process through their political wing, Sinn Féin, so they agreed. Republican leaders came out in support of Scapp: Gerry Adams, Martin McGuinness, and the former head of publicity for Sinn Féin, Danny Morrison.
But if you now look at and zero in on the allegations and on the particular names that's been bandied about, there's absolutely no connection there.
2 decades on, he tells me why he reacted like this.
Had I turned around and say, "Yes, Freddie Scappaticci was Stakeknife, this explains everything," then dissident Republicans would have turned around and said, "Hold on a minute. You're condemning Freddie Scappaticci on the basis of a guy called Martin Ingram, who's a former intelligence officer himself."
Martin Ingram being the pseudonym used by former Frew handler Ian Hurst.
It isn't even his right name. So I just had to play a bit careful about how I approached it. And as the situation, let's say, normalised, or people became more familiarised with the facts, then I became more and more public with it.
This guy was up to his balls in betrayal, and nobody touched him.
Former IRA member Ricky O'Rourke again. Why did he not get a greater interrogation or punishment?
This is one of the conundrums in all of this. My view is that he had something on him. Freddie Scappaticci was nobody's fool. He was a smart enough wee guy, and I think that he would have taken out insurance against the day when everything went pear-shaped.
There's another theory, as John Ware explains.
It was like the bank, he was just too big to fail. If the head of security was an agent, where does that leave anyone? Yeah, the sight of that guy lying on a road, hands bound, left to rot, would have sent a chill through the entire movement. And so I think the decision was taken not to have him tried and executed.
Scapp was emboldened by this support.
He gave an interview to the Andersonstown News, a very long interview. He was, I think, photographed with his grandchildren. He was putting himself about saying, "This is Freddie Scappaticci, a spy, outrageous, totally untrue."
The unmasking of Scapp had a strange twist. It brought 2 arch enemies onto the same page, the British government and the IRA. They both had a powerful vested interest in never acknowledging that Scapp was Stakeknife. Jane Winter, the former director of British-Irish Rights Watch, says,
"The IRA were deeply, deeply shocked to discover how deeply they'd been penetrated. and were losing face rapidly because of it. So it was in their interests to deny that Scappaticci actually was Stakeknife and to kind of throw around as much smoke and mirrors as they possibly could.
The British government, along with the army and MI5, couldn't be associated with someone who'd been involved in such brutal crimes, especially with the peace process still at such a delicate stage.
We were watching a sort of Faustian pact unfold.
There was a sort of unholy alliance between the IRA and the government.
In this strange new world, Scap saw an opportunity to twist the arm of the government and force them to clear his name, to prove his so-called innocence.
He demanded that the British state publicly deny that he'd ever been a spy. Specifically, he demanded that the Minister of State for Northern Ireland, then Jane Kennedy, issue a statement that refuted the allegation that he was Stakeknife. In other words, he was demanding that the British government tell a flat-out lie.
But Jane Kennedy wasn't going to do that. In fact, she told Parliament as much.
I will not comment on intelligence matters. I will not confirm whether press speculation about Stakeknife is accurate. Neither will I comment on Stakeknife's whereabouts, nor will I comment on media speculation about any arrangements for his safety.
She was drawing on a long-standing doctrine in the secretive world of intelligence to never speak about issues related to national security, a policy known as neither confirm nor deny, or NCND. On MI5's website, they say, secrecy is essential if the agencies are to be able to perform their statutory functions effectively. For MI5, the information protected by the NCND policy includes the identities of our investigative targets, the covert techniques and methods we use to investigate them, and not least, covert human intelligence sources, better known as agents. In other words, they won't respond to claims or speculation regarding agents.
Which has served as a sort of shield over decades, shield against, answering awkward questions about intelligence and indeed in some cases covering up unscrupulous or criminal behaviour.
The whole doctrine of neither confirm nor deny is a cover-up mechanism in itself.
Realising the government wasn't going to break the policy that easily, Scap made an audacious move.
He quite cynically decided to exploit the courts to try to force the government to deny that he was Stakeknife, which of course was a lie.
He brought a judicial review to challenge the government's policy of neither confirm nor deny.
Scappaticci told MI5 that he was going to take a judicial review on the basis that the government had a duty to reduce the risk to his life. Essentially what he was doing was trying to tell the wider Republican community that he, Freddie Scappaticci, was not a tout, that he was the innocent victim of a gross injustice by the media, and they had put his life in grave, grave peril. And the government's silence was making things worse, so they needed to break that silence and say he was not Stakeknife.
Was it true he was in peril?
Not according to MI5, at least not in immediate peril. The director of terrorism for Northern Ireland advised that he was not in any immediate danger. And frankly, Scappaticci's own behaviour, the fact that he'd come back to Belfast to front all this out. And
he'd even signed a waiver to that fact.
He had indeed. So everybody knew the score.
The judicial review would involve Scap lying under oath and saying he'd never been an agent.
MI5 say, Freddie, do not commit perjury. 2 days later, he swears on the Holy Bible before a solicitor, on oath, that he was not, nor ever had been, a security force agent, whether known as Stakeknife or by any other name.
This set off alarm bells within Whitehall, amid fears that Scappaticci was going rogue. If Scap won, the government would have two options: lie on the record and commit perjury, or expose their former agent. There was no way they could come clean, given the brutal crimes Scapp had committed while working for the Fru. It would be too big a scandal. To everyone's horror, the first judge ruled that Scapp had a case, and it looked like he could actually win. A court date was set. MI5 and the government realised they would have to take unprecedented measures to stop the truth from getting out. This is one of the things we now have new information about. A month before the hearing, an emergency meeting took place between senior officials.
MI5 officials from the Attorney General's office, the Ministry of Defence. The picture painted to them was pretty bleak.
Philip Sales, a barrister who represented the government in important cases, gave them concerning advice. He told them they faced a risk. If the judge thought Scapp was not Stakeknife, the judge could force the government to comment on Scapp's status as an agent. So they came up with a solution.
To ensure that the judge hearing the case should know the facts, that Scappaticci was indeed Stakeknife.
The officials decided that Philip Sales should arrange a private meeting with the Lord Chief Justice of Northern Ireland, Sir Robert Carswell.
In fairness, I'm sure they would say it was very important for the court not to be misled about Scappaticci's lies. And that is a perfectly respectable legal argument. It happens all the time. On the other hand, it certainly served their purpose.
They even told Scapp what they were going to do.
My understanding is that MI5 consulted Scappaticci, got his approval for the plan.
But Sir Robert Carswell wasn't that easy to reach.
Interestingly, the first approach that was made to Sir Robert's office was rebuffed.
So what happened then?
They eventually managed to get a private meeting with Sir Robert.
4 days before the hearing, Philip Sales got on a plane and flew to Belfast. He travelled towards the Stormont estate and met Sir Robert at his home.
Sales told Sir Robert that Scappaticci had lied on oath, that he was actually the agent Stakeknife, that he absolutely didn't want the government to break their silence on him for obvious reasons, but was taking the case to essentially maintain his cover so that he could continue to live in Belfast.
Sir Robert decided he should be the one to hear the case.
Instead of recusing himself, Sir Robert decided to take over the case from the judge scheduled to hear it.
How did that play out in the public hearing?
The only people in the court who knew exactly what had been going on was the judge, Sir Robert Carswell, and the applicant, Freddie Scappaticci. No one else had a clue. Neither the press, the public, nor other lawyers had a clue about all the backroom manoeuvrings, if you like.
Sir Robert Carswell came to a decision. The government did not have to break their policy and confirm that Freddie Scappaticci was an agent. I've asked a colleague to read his judgment.
Once the government confirms in the case of one person that he is not an agent, a refusal to comment in the case of another person would then give rise to an immediate suspicion that the latter was in fact an agent, so possibly placing his life in grave danger.
One can imagine it was relief all round. Certainly for Scappaticci it was, and certainly it was for MI5 and, of course, the government.
The whole case was publicly funded through legal aid, even though Scapp was getting generous payments from the state, effectively a pension for his time as an agent.
To be clear, and in fairness, no barrister I've spoken to has suggested that, the government had behaved unlawfully. But as one government lawyer put it to me, the case brought by Scappaticci was, in his words, a sham.
In the UK's democracy, the executive and the judiciary should be separate.
But in this case, there was a degree of overlap.
Jane Winter was following closely at the time.
I was aware that there had been shenanigans. Why is that necessary if there isn't something that they're trying to hide?
You've seen a lot in your time, Jane. Do you think this seems like an act of cover-up?
Yes. In a word.
It may not be unlawful, but it sure does look grubby.
Even more grubby is the fact that, as part of the backroom discussions before the hearing, the intelligence services knowingly misled the judge and Philip Sales. At that secret meeting, Philip Sales gave Sir Robert Carswell a document containing information supplied by MI5. It spelled out that Freddie Scappaticci was indeed the agent known as Stakeknife. It also contained information that it now appears MI5 must have known was misleading. It said Scap had provided life-saving intelligence as an agent, but it failed to mention that at that very moment, Scap was under investigation by the police for his involvement in the abduction, torture, and murder of dozens of people. More on that after this short break.
Hello, Venetia Rainey here, one of the executive producers on Bed of Lies. When I'm not working on this brilliant series, I host another Telegraph podcast, Battle Lines. Battle Lines combines on-the-ground dispatches from Telegraph journalists with analysis to help you better understand the complex world of global security, something that's more important than ever before. Follow Battle Lines wherever you're listening to this.
Sit how you want to sit, yeah. I'm in the studio at the Telegraph's offices with John Ware, who's reporting this episode with me. He's brought in a long-time source of his, former police officer Phil James.
Got the train down to Victoria.
Phil was the lead detective on John Stevens' third inquiry into the murder of lawyer Pat Finucane. He was essentially the new Vince McFadden. Vince had taken a less hands-on role for this inquiry after a decade of travelling back and forth to Northern Ireland.
Vince was the man. He used to drive me nuts. Absolutely nuts. Because he'd sidle up to my desk, or he'd come in my office, he'd say, "Phil, did I ever tell you this?" And I go, "No, Vince, you haven't. Why haven't you?"
Phil's time in Belfast started in the same way as Vince's.
I got a phone call from a mutual friend saying, did I fancy going to Northern Ireland to do a job?
It was 1999, and he was an officer in the Met Police, where John Stevens was Deputy Commissioner.
I was working on the murder team at Kensington, and a week later, if I hadn't have gone, I would have been on the Jill Dando inquiry, because she was murdered, sadly, a week after I left.
The case took over Phil's life, just like it had done for Vince and John Stevens.
I was told it's going to be 6 months. I never went back to the Metropolitan Police. That's the reality of it. It became the rest of my career.
How many years is that?
It was another 12 years.
That's a common story in this.
Yeah, you don't get. But once you've got knowledge, it's very difficult to take a step back from it.
Partly because there was so much to unravel. While they were pulling at the threads of Brian Nelson's involvement in Pat's murder, they got another tip-off. An army liaison officer said to them,
"You haven't seen anything yet. There's another one of these in the wings."
Another high-profile agent, a mirror image of Brian Nelson in the IRA, Stakeknife. Not long before Freddie Scappaticci was outed in the press, Phil started properly looking into him.
I've asked two of my finest guys, let's have a look. What have we got?
They started with 7 cases of murder and abduction that Scap had allegedly been involved in. Just like with all the other stages of the Stevens inquiry, it wasn't going to be easy.
I was laughing to myself. Here in JSA, we go where the evidence takes us. But it's a trite old saying, and it is his. But it's so true. There's nothing else you can do.
But the situation had changed since John Stevens and Vince McFadden investigated Brian Nelson.
They got that almost fresh. They had that evidence. That was a big difference to Stakeknife, it wasn't fresh at all. There's plenty of intelligence, but precious little evidence.
More than a decade had passed since Scap had been active in the IRA.
It was like putting together a jigsaw puzzle without the corners and no picture. So the trick is to try and turn that intelligence into evidence. But in the environment, the Northern Irish environment, the whole thing of secrecy, of don't talk to the cops, it's almost impossible. Almost impossible. You need a huge breakthrough.
What they really needed were the Army's detailed records of their handling of Stakeknife. But unlike with Brian Nelson, they couldn't get hold of these, because the Army regularly destroyed all documents after 5 years.
That had run out for Stakeknife documentation. That was all gone.
Very convenient, that.
Well, if you were looking at it in a slightly unkindly way, you'd think they probably learnt their lesson from Nelson.
There was one organisation that did have access to more records, MI5. They claimed they only found out Scapp was an agent after he was exposed and needed to be resettled. But they did have copies of Army and police records, which they'd kept securely locked away.
What was your experience of the degree of cooperation or otherwise that the service gave you?
They were always super polite, and I would ask. So if it came up on a particular case like, I don't know, Fenton, I would say, have you got any product for Fenton?
Mm-hmm.
And I would get a reply back saying, yes, we've got this, or no, we haven't got that.
Product meaning files.
Yeah, exactly.
Phil and the team had to ask MI5 very precise questions to get the right material back. It was by no means a transparent system. One day, Phil probed someone from MI5 about this.
And I said to him something along the lines of, how do I know I'm getting everything I asked for? And he turned around to me and he said, you don't.
One early finding shocked Phil. Definitive evidence of how Scapp had come by his get-out-of-jail card for Sandy Lynch's abduction and torture. At the time, Scapp appeared to have a credible alibi, or so his lawyer Kevin Winters thought.
At the time, I thought that was simply down to some reasonably effective legal choreography. Of course, what we now know today is something completely different.
Phil had found evidence of a plot between the Frew and the police to fabricate an alibi for Scapp. They needed to explain why Scapp's fingerprints had been found on a battery in the debugging device at the house where Scapp had tortured Sandy Lynch. The alibi came from the homeowners and said Scapp had previously done work there, but it was all a lie.
The shocker for me was that this was written down and sitting on an Army file, unredacted, just sitting there. Someone must have missed it. It's something I've never forgotten, put it that way, and I saw a lot.
It was evidence of an attempt to pervert the course of justice. Kevin Winters says,
There is a serious question mark about the police and security force handling of that at the time. I was a bit part player in a wider choreography to ensure the release of Mr. Scappaticci.
Phil sent the evidence to the Criminal Case Review Commission. The new information about Scapp being an agent made the convictions for the other people involved in Sandy Lynch's abduction unsound. That included Danny Morrison, who was arrested in the police raid just after he arrived at the scene.
I got out of jail in 95, and it was another 12 or 13 years before the Court of Criminal Appeal,
where their convictions were quashed.
we sued them for malicious prosecution.
What compensation did you get?
Well, substantial.
This was one of the few pieces of concrete evidence Phil and his team found of criminality by Scapp's handlers and the police. Of course, there was one person who could give them everything they needed: Freddie Scappaticci himself. They arrested him in 2004 after he'd been outed in the press.
He was very different from what you saw on the telly at that time. He was much more withdrawn. He wasn't bullshit. I never saw him in his pomp when he was doing the terrible things that were alleged against him. His world had come crashing in. Yeah, without a doubt. And it would never be the same again.
Phil was unimpressed by Scapp, like he had been when he interviewed Brian Nelson.
They're totally underwhelming. They don't look like you think they're going to look like. I always think they look like taxi drivers.
Scapp was far more tight-lipped than Brian had been. Phil questioned Scapp about case after case. For example, the brutal execution of estate agent and special branch informer Joe Fenton, who was executed minutes after Scapp had finished interrogating him.
He didn't say a word to us, not a word.
Eventually, Phil and his colleague gave up and left the room.
And then he asked to see us both. And I looked at Dave and I said, is this it? Is he going to tell us everything now? Because we needed a breakthrough, it'd be fabulous. So we go back in, I'm thinking, this is it. This is knighthoods, medals, all sorts. And he said, he just turned around to us, big smile on his face, he says, I am not as bad as they make me out to be. He goes, that's all I've got to say.
But Phil found Scapp was just as bad as he'd been made out to be.
We confirmed the suspicions that had been raised, that there was another Nelson-type figure out there, perhaps in an even crazier position, and people definitely had died. Definitely.
Did you confirm that Freddie Scappaticci was known within the army as Stakeknife?
I don't think I can answer that question, is my honest answer to you. I don't think neither confirm nor deny. I don't think even now I can even confirm that, but...
Worth asking.
Worth asking.
As more evidence emerged that proved Scapp was Stakeknife, the authorities' insistence on neither confirming nor denying that fact reached a point of absurdity. Scapp accepted MI5's offer of resettlement after a year, and they moved him to England with a new identity. But that didn't mean he was now silent.
Between 2003 and 2006, Freddie Scappaticci swore no fewer than 4 affidavits.
Legal documents in which people swear they're telling the truth. But Scapp's first affidavit for the judicial review contained an outright lie when he said he'd never been an agent. He then signed 3 more affidavits which referred to that first one. Lying under oath is a crime called perjury, and it can carry a maximum sentence of 7 years in prison.
There was quite a public fuss being made of it.
By 2 people I've been speaking to, human rights advocate Jane Winter and former FRU soldier Ian Hurst. Ian had met Jane after he blew the whistle on Stakeknife because of Scapp's involvement in the murder of fellow agents.
I got arrested. I'd taken my phones and everything like that.
Ian had made a lot of enemies in the British establishment and the IRA, and he needed Jane's help navigating his new life.
He'd been mainly in hiding most of the time that I knew him, and using the acronym of Martin Ingram.
From his hiding place, Ian was determined to hold Scapp to account.
He was very annoyed by the fact that Freddie Scappaticci was saying that he wasn't Stakeknife.
This annoyance escalated into a vendetta between Ian and Scapp.
He said that I owed him a duty of confidence. Well, how could I owe you a duty of confidence if you weren't Stakeknife? And if you admit that you are Stakeknife, then I will admit I owe you a duty of confidence. Never got a response back from that.
It was like an itch that he couldn't help but scratch.
Jane and Ian started writing letters to the police. The police's initial response was surprising.
The matter was not amenable to investigation because of the neither confirm nor deny policy.
But after 18 letters from Jane and Ian, the police finally opened a perjury investigation into Scapp.
I had very grave doubts, and it rapidly became evident that they were just going through the motions and not taking it seriously.
Behind the scenes, there were parts of the establishment that were concerned about the police investigation. If Scapp ended up on trial for perjury, the wall of secrecy around Stakeknife could come crashing down. The security services could be pressured to break their policy of neither confirm nor deny and provide evidence that Scapp was indeed Stakeknife.
If he had been prosecuted, a whole lot of stuff would have tumbled out.
Like the details about his involvement in dozens of murders and abductions while being paid by the state. Phil James was still conducting his own inquiry into those crimes, and he didn't know about the perjury case. Looking back, he says the security services should have cast Scapp out.
They should have said, we'll disavow you and you'll be subject to the law.
But despite everything Scapp had done, MI5 still had his back, and they were ready to interfere to prevent his true identity being confirmed. John Ware has discovered
it was pretty much controlled by MI5. They undermined the investigation from the start by not disclosing all relevant information to the police. The police, for their part, appear to have failed to ask some pretty searching questions too.
When the senior officer on the case arrived at MI5's headquarters, the service only gave him one of Scapp's 4 affidavits. The first one he signed for his judicial review. But MI5 should have given the police all the evidence they had.
It's not their job to decide what is or isn't material and relevant to a criminal investigation.
One reason MI5 might have directed the police to Scapp's first affidavit is because Scapp had signed it shortly after he was outed in the press. He could claim he'd done so out of fear the IRA would seek vengeance, therefore giving him a defence of necessity or duress.
It's sometimes referred to as knife at the throat defence, meaning you've really got no choice but to lie to avoid death or serious injury.
But Scapp's behaviour at that time wasn't consistent with someone in fear of their life. He'd gone back to Belfast to chance his luck, after all. The police handed their findings to the Public Prosecution Service. They then needed to establish if there was enough evidence that could lead to a conviction, and if there was, would a prosecution be in the public interest? The Prosecution Service assigned lawyer Pamela Atchison to the case. She went to MI5's headquarters to start digging.
And she, too, gets a file, I think a very thin file, and she gets instructions from the security service. She is told, as I understand it, here's a laptop, you will work on this laptop. None of the files that we give you will be kept in your office.
Like with the police, MI5 only gave Pamela one of Scapp's affidavits. On the point of if Scapp lied because he was in fear of imminent death, the investigation became even more unconventional. This is important because it fed into the likelihood of a prosecution succeeding against Scapp. Pamela wanted to interview Scapp under caution to establish the truth about his mental state.
To find out if he really was as fearful as he appears to be claiming.
But MI5 wasn't going to have that. They said they'd done their own psychiatric report, and Scapp wasn't fit for interview.
In fact, he might kill himself if there were any proceedings. For most ordinary suspected villains, that kind of option wouldn't have been available to them. Ordinarily, the PPS would say, well, look, we'll get our own independent assessment as to whether he's in a fit state to be interviewed under caution. But I gather that didn't happen. And then came the verdict.
There was insufficient evidence to prosecute Freddie Scappaticci for perjury. Jane Winter received an unusually brief letter from the Director of Public Prosecutions with the decision.
And it didn't say on what basis the DPP had made this decision.
According to the Prosecution Service Code, these letters should spell out how decisions were made. But this one didn't.
That to me was a big issue, was which leg was he standing on.
It would have been perfectly legitimate for the Public Prosecution Service to say, whatever the evidence, it's not in the public interest that a former senior agent should be prosecuted for all kinds of reasons. Of course, if that had been the case, that was as good as saying, well, he's an agent.
Scapp didn't just escape prosecution for perjury, but also for murder. Around the same time as the perjury investigation closed, the Stevens inquiry chapter on Stakeknife was also wound down. The cost of trying to turn intelligence into evidence was just too high. The work of Phil James and his team was packed into 32 boxes, which gathered dust for the best part of the next decade. Then, in 2012, the Stakeknife files were reopened. Families of some of Scapp's victims urged the police ombudsman to review the Stevens inquiry evidence. They found new leads. So in 2016, a second criminal investigation into Stakeknife began. Operation Kenova. A new request soon came their way. The Director of Public Prosecutions, Barra McGrory, had reviewed the decision not to prosecute Scapp for perjury. He had several concerns. One of them was that Scapp hadn't been interviewed under caution to assess the truth about his mental state. Barra McGrory said to us over email,
"The matter of whether Scappaticci had a viable defence of necessity should have been for the jury to decide, not the prosecution service." And McGrory also says that the whole affair caused, quotes, "very considerable damage to the integrity of the administration of justice."
Kenova reinvestigated the perjury case and found Pamela Atchison from the prosecution service had been entirely reliant on the candour of MI5 lawyers. Kenova also concluded MI5 had withheld evidence from both the prosecution service and the police.
MI5 were, to put it mildly, unenthusiastic about this investigation, and I think the same can be said probably for the Northern Ireland Police. I did put that actually to the senior detective in charge of the investigation, but I got no response.
We heard back from Pamela Atchison, who says,
"She never took prosecution decisions which were, as she put it, improperly influenced by the neither confirm nor deny policy considerations. And the current DPP says the decision she took had been correct."
Kenova sent new files about Scapp to the prosecution service for perjury and for perverting the course of justice. They also sent files on Pamela Atchison and 2 MI5 officers for possible misconduct in public office. But once again, MI5 intervened, this time to say files couldn't go to the prosecution service because the security clearance for their Belfast office had expired. It took 5 months before MI5 allowed the files to be submitted. The prosecution service found no case to answer against Pamela Atchison, the 2 MI5 officers, and Freddie Scappaticci. Kenova's investigation into Scapp wasn't over, but for now, he could live his quiet retirement in Guildford as Frank Conway. Former Frew handler Ian Hurst wasn't too upset about this outcome.
In truth, I'm not really bothered about Scappaticci, and this is going to be contentious here. The directing mind, in a criminal sense, has to be the handlers, the agency, and ultimately the government in general.
Scapp's handlers in the Frew had been on the target list of Phil James and his fellow Stevens 3 detectives. But that too was challenging, as Phil explains.
It was brick walls everywhere we went. It's impenetrable. Once the curtains are up, that's it. Nobody broke cover. Not really. The only thing that they could do is talk themselves into trouble. They couldn't talk themselves out of trouble because there was no evidence as such.
Phil James questioned Gordon Kerr under caution. He had him in a London police station for 5 long days, sitting across from one another, going through the details.
He was an angry man with me. He was angry that how he, as a lieutenant colonel in the British Army, this is my impression, it is not necessarily what he thought, was how dare we have the audacity.
What did he tell you?
Absolutely nothing.
Gordon wouldn't answer Phil's questions, but he did bring a prepared statement, which he read out.
It was quite a lengthy document.
Phil can't remember all the details so many years later, and he can't refer back to the files because they're securely locked away.
Everything I refer to will be part of the Stevens 3 documentation, which sits in probably Sea Park. I haven't got access to it.
The police headquarters at the edge of darkness, where John Stevens' headquarters were burnt down, now holds a secure archive of the Troubles, known colloquially as the Vault. The crux of Gordon's statement was that he believed his unit had been working for the greater good of society, and that they had done so within the legal framework they were given, or more precisely, lack of.
Cops by nature like to have boundaries to work to, because you're in that world of, that's the law, you've broken it, boom. I think within that, you obviously did get people who pushed the envelope way, way too far, and terrible, terrible things happen. We are stretching morality to its nth degree, criminality. It was an absolute grey, horrible mess.
The Stevens inquiry sent files on some 20 members of the security forces to the prosecution service.
It was all the handlers and the management of the FRU. The offences that we put to the director were something like misfeasance in a public office.
But the prosecution service decided, once again, that no one would face a criminal trial, including Gordon Kerr. There was insufficient evidence for a prosecution to be likely to succeed.
What I would say from Lord Stevens and myself and the rest of the gang, we did everything that was asked of us. And we took it as far as we possibly could.
I've been trying to track down Gordon Kerr myself. I want to hear what he thinks about the FRU's work all these years later, and what he'd like to say to the bereaved families I've been speaking to. The last time we heard from him, he was the military attaché to Beijing. It's not clear what he did next, and he's disappeared since. He's never given an interview, but I want to try. I've asked a reporter I've been working with in Belfast to do some digging. He's called Mick Brown. Mick got a tip years ago that Gordon Kerr used to drink at a cricket club in Fermanagh.
And I thought if he was socialising in the local cricket club in Fermanagh in the west, then he probably maybe married a lady down there and maybe had family. And so that's what I went searching for. And after I got the correct date of birth, it was easy to pin him down because his career profession was listed as Army officer.
Mick found a marriage certificate for Gordon Kerr from the late 1970s and a birth certificate for his child.
So it was a bit ironic, actually, looking for the files on the man who had all the files.
With this information, I have a chance of finding out where Gordon lives now. I get an address in Scotland, and I ask a local journalist, Mark McCaskill, if he'll go and find out more.
You can't drive up his street because it's kind of like there's like a cul-de-sac, and you can't actually. You can drive to the top, but then there's a row of houses, which I think is where he's is. It's a really narrow kind of lane almost. So essentially, you can't actually see his house from sitting in the car. So I'm going to get out in a second and just walk up there.
Mark knocks on a couple of doors, and a neighbour answers.
What I told him was, as you said, just that I'm working for you guys and we're trying to contact Gordon Kerr regarding a podcast on the Troubles. And that's when he said, oh yeah, I think Gordon worked in the Merchant Navy, so he seemed a bit puzzled by that.
It's not clear if the Gordon Kerr who lives at this address is the one I'm looking for. So Mark takes out his phone and shows the neighbour a photo from Gordon's time as military attaché in Beijing. He's in army fatigues and has a weather-beaten face. The neighbour gives us a definitive answer. It's a different person. We're at the address of the wrong Gordon Kerr. It feels like we've exhausted all leads. But then, late one Friday afternoon, I get an email. It's from Gordon Kerr's lawyer. They've been listening to the podcast, so I send back a list of questions. In their reply, they point me towards the De Silva report, which Gordon gave evidence for. But unfortunately, we won't get any more information. They say Gordon Kerr is bound by the Official Secrets Act, and he can't comment further. 17 years after Detective John Stevens first arrived in Northern Ireland, the Stevens inquiry drew to a close. But the hunt for truth and justice continues, and the investigations are far from over. For all the resources poured into investigating Freddie Scappaticci and Brian Nelson, you could be left thinking that they're two rogue agents, isolated bad apples who became involved in the worst atrocities of the Troubles, who stand alone in their viciousness. But in my reporting, I've learnt the picture is much bigger than those two. In the 30-year conflict, many hundreds of agents were embedded in the IRA and loyalist paramilitaries. Agents who were involved in kidnaps, killings, and bomb-making. The full scale of what's happened is only just being exposed. Coming up on Bed of Lies.
Spies were everywhere. They had infiltrated the IRA at all levels.
The gunman pointed the gun at me and says, "You have 24 hours to get out of Ireland."
This was a state agent infiltrating the IRA. How was he going to get away with this?
Loyalist paramilitaries were infiltrated from the top down.
That level of despair and anguish just never left.
They're living so close by. They're walking with their heads held high. And we're living miserable. And they're living happy. But you know, we walk past them in the streets. Can't believe it.
Bed of Lies is a Telegraph podcast written by me, Cara McGugan, and produced by Sarah Peters at Tuning Fork Productions. This episode is reported by me and John Ware. The executive producers are Louisa Wells and Venetia Rainey. Sound design by Rich Evans. Production assistance from Georgia Cohen, with thanks to Ryan Gudge and Theodora Laludis. For more of my in-depth reporting, my book, The Poison Line, Life and Death in the Infected Blood Scandal, is out now with Penguin. If you haven't already done so, listen to the award-winning first two series of Bed of Lies on this feed, in which I investigate two very different scandals.